Boker Tov, good morning, everyone. We are in Shemuel Aleph, Perek Kaf Daled, chapter 24. If you have the Hebrew English Saks Chumash, we're on page 699. We've done a lot of chapters in which the end of the chapter left us with a little bit of a pit in our stomach, right? Something bad happened, a little bit of a negative view on the character. I'm hoping that the end of this chapter, by the time we reach it, you'll have a little bit of warmth. You'll have a little bit of a feel-good experience by the end of this chapter to keep you warm on a nice cold day, because we've had a lot of tension between Shaul, who's a great person, and David, who's a great person as well. And we've had a lot of unfortunate things to say about King Shaul as we watched his roller coaster ride to the end of his kingdom. And this chapter, I think, is going to, perhaps more than any other chapter, show us the greatness of Shaul, why he is still, in our vision, a great character, a tragic figure in many ways, but still somebody who we promote as far as his characteristics and his traits as a great leader of the Jewish people. That's why he still looked like that in the pantheon of great people of Am Yisrael, amongst more of the positive people than the negative ones. And so let's proceed. This chapter 24 is going to bring us to an epic encounter between David and Shaul, a conversation that they'll have together, and what appears to be a form of a reconciliation, but not 100%. So let's go through it. We're on chapter 24, Pasuk 1. There's a little bit of a difference between some of the Tanachim as to where chapter 24 begins. Some of them have that last pasuk in the previous chapter as really the first pasuk in this chapter. However, you may read it, the last pasuk of the previous chapter, as I have it, has the words Vayal David Misham, that David went up from there, Vayeshiv bimtzadot En Gedi, and he found himself in a place called En Gedi. We're very familiar with En Gedi. I'm sure anybody who's been to Israel has toured and looked at En Gedi with the ibex and the cliffs and the rivers and the caves and things like that. David finds himself in En Gedi, and to remind ourselves, Shaul was on hot pursuit of David and was so close to catching him until he was told that the Pelishtim had invaded Israel, and Shaul had a choice to make: chase after David, his enemy, and catch him and allow the Pelishtim to harm his people, or abort the mission of chasing David and fulfill his rightful duties as king. And we said Shaul made what appears in our eyes as the right decision to abandon the chase and to go do what he needed to do with the Pelishtim. Nevertheless, the beginning of Pasuk Perek Kaf Daled tells us that as soon as that situation dissolved, Shaul is right back on the chase towards David. So in Pasuk Aleph, as I have it, of chapter 24, Vahi ka'asher shav Shaul me'achare Pelishtim, when Shaul returned from his encounter with the Pelishtim, Vayagidu lo lemor, his men told him, Hine David b'midbar En Gedi. David finds himself in the wilderness of En Gedi. To which Vayikach Shaul shloshet alafim ish bachur mikol Israel. Shaul took 3,000 of the choicest men from all of Israel, right? Mikol Yisrael, from all of Israel. Vayelech vayvakesh et David va'anashav, and he went in search of David and his men, al penet sureh haye'arim, on the rocks of the wild goats. And this is why En Gedi fits that description, because the rocks of the wild goats, anybody who's been to En Gedi, you see ibex and goats running around all through that territory. So it fits the description. One thing to point out over here is that the text does not tell us what happened with Shaul and the Pelishtim. It doesn't tell us if Shaul was successful, did he win, did he lose, and that's deliberate. Why do you think the text is deliberately leaving out the results of Shaul's war with the Pelishtim? Not to focus on right. That. The results are irrelevant, right, Esther says. And the results are irrelevant because it was more the decision of Shaul to go and fight. There's the positive side of it. There's also the negative side of it, that as soon as Shaul handles his business with the Pelishtim, whatever it may be, he's right back on David's tail, because what's really in the mind of Shaul, what he really cares about more, is the Pelishtim or David. It's really David. The fact that it doesn't mention the results shows you that From the perspective of Shaul, what happened with the Philistine wasn't as important to him as what he wants to do with David, right? And so that's the negative side of things. There is both a positive and a negative side to Shaul's interaction with the Philistine. Let's go to Pasuk Dalid, or I have it Pasuk Gimal. Vayavo el gidrot hatzon al haderech v'sham me'ara. Shaul comes to the sheepfolds along the way, and there's a cave there. And he enters the cave. Vayavo Shaul lahasech et raglav. Shaul goes to relieve himself in the cave. V'David ve'anashav b'yarketeh ha'me'ara yoshevim. And David and his men are in the depths of the cave. They're in the back of the cave, and that's where they're hiding out. So if this was a drama unfolding in the movies right before you, Shaul walks into the cave, you'd hear a little background music of something, I don't know, like a deep bass type thing recording in the back of your mind. You know, Shaul is coming into the dark cave, David and his men are in the cave, an encounter is about to happen, what's going to take place? Now it seems that David and his men, they recognize Shaul, but Shaul does not know that they are there. Vayomeru anshed David elav. So the men of David, upon seeing Shaul and realizing his vulnerability, they turn to David, their leader, and say, Hine hayom, the time has come, the day has arrived. Asher amar Adonai elecha, that God had told you, Hine anochi noten et oyivcha biyadecha. Behold, I am giving your enemies into your hands. Ve'asita lo, and you shall do to him, ka'asher yitav be'enecha, as is good in your eyes. Vayakom David vayichrot et kenaf hameil asher l'Shaul balat. David gets up and he cuts the corner of Shaul's cloak. Balat. Balat means in secret, without Shaul feeling or knowing that David has done that. I'm going to read till the end of the paragraph, even though there's a lot to discuss here, and then we'll double back and look at it. Vayhib acharechen, after David does that, Vayach lev David oto. David's heart began to hit him. In other words, he felt remorse over the fact that he had cut Shaul's coat. Al asher karat et kanaf asher Shaul. On the matter that he had cut the corner of Shaul's cloak. David starts to feel the regret. His heart is pounding on him in that he feels remorse. Vayomer le'anashav. He then turns to his men and he says, Halila li me Adonai. It is beneath me in God's eyes. If I shall do this matter to my master, Limshiach Adonai, to the anointed one of God, Lishloach yadi bo, to stretch forth my hand upon him. Ki Meshiach Adonai hu, for he is the anointed one of God. Vaishasad David et anashav badevarim. David restrains and rebukes his men with his words. And he does not give them permission to come against Shaul and to kill Shaul. And Shaul gets up from the cave and he goes on his way, unbeknownst to him, everything that took place on the side. So David gets what appears to be an opportunity to rid himself of the one who's chasing him, the one who's trying to kill him. His men are prodding him to take advantage of this. It seems as though he would be fulfilling the prophecy of God, that God has instructed him that a day will come in which he has an opportunity to rid himself of his enemies, and he's given permission to do as he wants. David only cuts the cloak, and on that he regrets it, and then holds back his men from attacking Shaul. So, I mean, just your preliminary thoughts over here on the matters that's going on here in the cave. What do you make of this story? How do you view David? What happened here? Any questions that you might have over here? The word what? Okay.
By hearing that word, you could have.
So you think the word oyivcha, my enemy, kind of struck a chord with David in that they were painting Shaul in a light that maybe David himself did not see Shaul in that way.
But he was saved from him so many times. What was the threat? And like, he's not my enemy, and I'm just gonna, why should I kill him?
Right, so you're saying an enemy, your argument is an enemy. David, knowing that he has divine protection, cannot view Shaul as an enemy because an enemy is only somebody who could really harm him, and he knows Shaul can't really harm him.
Also because he's Shaul, so he's not my enemy.
Okay. I hear where you're coming from. It's an interesting perspective. Yeah.
Men are assuming that God is saying God has given you to him.
So the men are assuming. Why do you say they're assuming? Why do you say they're assuming? Why do you say they know?
It says God, where's that line? It says God has
Yeah, it said, where was it before? It's, I think, Pasuk, it's Pasuk Daled, right? David's men said to him, is now is the very moment that the Lord spoke of to you. Now I am handing your enemies over to you.
Right, so they are saying that it's like God gave it to you and you better act.
So why can't he act?
So, but that's not the message that he's getting from God.
What is the message David is getting from God?
David is such a great person that he knows the right thing to do.
And how does he know that why is the right thing to do over here not to attack Shaul who wants to kill him? Does David have a right to kill Shaul?
I don't know about that.
Well, let's say for a minute the story played out differently. Let's say David did kill Shaul for just a minute, hypothetically. Would we blame David? Would we say he did something wrong? We would. Why do you say that?
That's your enemy. Hashem always told, this is your enemy, go kill them. This is your enemy, go kill them, take them out, whatever. He was never told that Shaul is your enemy.
We would have to ask.
But okay, so you're kind of on the same page as Liz is that David is not looking at Shaul as an enemy, right? So I have a hard time with it only a little bit, only because David knows he's being chased by Shaul. He's been battering down his neck, ready to kill him. And the rule of thumb, halachically, let's go with a technical halachic rule, is that someone who's being chased to kill him, he's called a rodef. Shaul is a rodef. He's chasing David. Halacha, Jewish law, allows somebody to kill somebody who's chasing somebody in their pursuit. So David, that doesn't matter. The fact that Shaul, you're right, Shaul is not in his right mind, which makes him even more dangerous and lethal. Even after, by the way, we'll see in this chapter that they reconcile, he still is being chased by Shaul because Shaul's not in his right mind. He's been taken over by this ruach ra'ah. I don't want to use the word crazy, God forbid, but that's the point. David has no idea what Shaul is capable of doing, and he's chasing him to kill him. If David were to kill Shaul, as tragic as that might be, it's self-defense. David has every right to kill somebody who's chasing him to kill him. So I don't know that we could fault David. At this moment, you're right, but I don't know. Maybe, but Shaul's got 3,000 men outside the cave who, when he finds out that David is in there, they'll come in to kill him, right? So is David? You're right. In that moment, Shaul is relieving himself. David's in the cave. That interaction at that particular second, Shaul is not a threat to David. David's in the position of power. Shaul's in the position of vulnerability. But if David took advantage of that moment, hard for us to potentially say that he committed something wrong. I see somebody, I think it's Candice. Candice wants to maybe chime in. I want to see if she can.
Okay, did I unmute myself?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Rabbi. So the only thing that came to mind was, if you try not to do another, not that it was necessarily a sin, as you say, but try not to murder somebody else to try to make up for the fact of what he did with Bathsheba's husband in war. And also, I think, aren't you not supposed to cut clothing? Something with the cloak that you're not supposed to defame.
Okay, so I'll address those 2 points. First of all, it's important to understand the order. As of now, there's no Bathsheba situation. David is not king. We don't know who Bathsheba is. In chronology, that hasn't happened yet. So that situation doesn't factor in to what we're talking about here. As far as David cutting the cloak of Shaul, we will see David himself regrets it. And we will see that the rabbis even say that David was punished for that act of cutting the cloak.
Right, so maybe that was the regret. Maybe the regret wasn't him not killing. Maybe the regret was just the cloak part.
That is the regret. No, the regret for sure over here is not that David does not regret what he did because he regretted, I should have killed Shaul. No, the regret is clearly, the text says it explicitly, in verse 5, David's heart is pounding on him, is reproaching him because he cut the corner of Shaul's cloak, that he shouldn't have even done that. Even that he shouldn't have done. So that's clearly the regret on the part of David.
That he could have.
Well, we'll see. David will use that as proof. David will take that and he'll have a conversation with Shaul. But we haven't had that yet. The question becomes, here's really what I want to get at. What I want to get at is two things. Number one, let's start from the beginning and we'll unpack it. When David's men say to him, behold, the day has come in which God said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands, right? Notice, by the way, it's written enemies in the plural. It's read enemy in the singular. Could be referring to Shaul, but we don't know. That's the question. Did God ever actually tell this to David? We have no mention. We have not read anywhere in the text of the Navi that God had told David, I am going to orchestrate a day in which you will be able to avenge yourself against your enemies. We did not see anything like that. The men are telling this to David. The question is this really true? So some opinions, for example, the Radak, I will read to you the words of Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi. He says that David must have, although it wasn't recorded, must have received some kind of prophecy from any one of the prophets who we know has a relationship with David. I'll read to you the Radak's words. He says, Amar lo al yedeh Shemuel, either somehow Shemuel must have gotten that message to David, or Gad, or another Navi that we know David had sought out, which was Gad, or Natan HaNavi, or a Navi who will come a little bit on the scene later on, is a Navi by the name of Natan. All of these Nevi'im, these prophets, lived at the time of David and had a relationship with David. So while the prophecy is not recorded, it must be, says the Radak, that the men know of a prophecy which David had received from one of these prophets, and this is the text's way of exposing it to us, right? She'iten oivav biyadav, that his enemies will come to his hands, and that David will be successful as a king. However, says the Radak, what David did not know, aval al Shaul lo ne'emar lo, specifically about the idea that he would have a time to kill Shaul, that was not given to him as a prophecy. Obviously, if David had received a direct prophecy from God that he's permitted or even commanded to kill Shaul at that moment, David would not have hesitated. He would have taken God at his word. Obviously, David received some kind of a generic prophecy, says the Radak, that his enemies will be given to his hand, but nothing specifically about Shaul, and therefore David does not know if God has given him the license to stretch his hand and kill Shaul, who, whether you like it or not, is still the de facto king of Israel. To stretch your hand and kill a king, no matter what, is not a simple thing to justify or to do, right? Now, aval anshe David amrulo, what his men were saying, they were trying to prod David as to say, look, David, once God promised you, that your enemies will come to your hand, look, who right now is your worst enemy? Who's the guy who's standing in the way of you and becoming king, which we know you're going to become king? It's Shaul. He's the one who's trying to kill you. So look, here it is. Here's the day. God is orchestrating it. Here you go. He's in your hands. Says the Radak, now we understand why there's a double language here. The Navi writes it as oivecha, your enemies, because that's what David has. David has the prophecy, it's enemies, it could be anybody. But they're telling him, no, it's oivcha, it's this enemy, it's Shaul. You should go and attack Shaul. So David's got a conflict now. David's not sure. According to Radak, he has this prophecy. It's generic in nature. How does he interpret it? Is it applicable to Shaul? Not applicable to Shaul. The men are saying it's about Shaul. David's not so sure. Okay? That's the way that Radak looks at this situation. I will tell you, there's another opinion. I read Rabbi Nun Bazak over here argues that there was no prophecy. There was no explicit prophecy. The men are telling David, you were anointed king. Who stands, if you're anointed king and you're going to become king, there's only one person who stands in your way of taking the rightful throne of the king. Who's that? Shaul. It must be that if God brought you here, he wants you to kill Shaul. And Shaul is trying to kill you. So legally, you have every right to kill him. Here it goes. Take your opportunity. Kill him, assume the throne, and all will be good. But the men are not telling him that it was based on a prophecy.
That one's much less. That one has much less weight because they're making a lot more.
Of course, and that's why, according to that, Rabbi Amnon Bazak says that's why David didn't listen to them, right? That's why David didn't listen to them, because how does David know that their assessment of the situation is at all correct, that gives him any right to kill the king? Yeah, sometimes you have to read it with fresh eyes. The question is, does David have the right? Legally, halachically, I believe that he does have the right. The question is, David still is hesitant. And the question is, how much has God exposed to him? How much has God not exposed to him? But whatever you want to say over here, David is clearly being motivated by his men to do something. Now, let's come to an even bigger and more important question. Let's see what you get on this. Look again at verse 4 very carefully. David is being told by his men, your enemy is here. Do to him as you please. And look at the next words. Vayakom David. David got up. Vayichrot et kenaf ha'me'il asher leShaul balad. And he cuts the coat secretively. And then right after that, he becomes remorseful of the fact that he did that, right? And then he tells his men, do not do anything to him. Chalil ali. The Lord forbids me that I should do such a thing, that I should raise my hand against him, almost as if like he still has the opportunity to kill him and he still wants to kill him. And then David has to hold back his men from killing him. What happens here? You can see that the order of events is a little bit bumpy. What was David's original intention? When David got up, the pasuk says, Vayakom David, after he heard his men saying to him, go kill him. And it says, Vayakom David, David got up. At that moment, what was in his mind? What do you think David wanted to do at that time? Huh? So that Al-Bag says what Esther said, that David at that moment got up and he was going to kill Shaul. He was. And the Al-Bag goes further to say, David tried to kill Shaul. The Al-Bag says. The words Vayakom David in flow of the men telling him that gives the Al-Bag the impression that David heard the words of his men, immediately Vayakom, he got up and he tried to enact what his men said. He wanted to kill him and he tried to kill him, but he was unsuccessful. All he ended up with, let's go with the interpretation straight through and then we'll ask questions. Let's just follow the interpretation. And what ended up happening? But all he was able to do was cut the cloak. That's the only thing he was able to do. And then afterwards, says the Ralbag, when he cut the cloak, having realized that he actually attempted to kill Shaul, he regretted not only the cutting of the cloak, but what the cutting of the cloak represented, which was his attempt to actually kill the king. And that explains the Khalil Ali. And then it also explains why he has to restrain his men. Because after David got up to kill the king, right, to kill Shaul, and he was unsuccessful, what's the next logical thing the men are going to do? They're going to come and support him and try to kill him. And at that point, David has changed his mind. He regrets that he ever thought about killing the king, ever tried to kill the king. He's upset about the Knaf HaMe'il, which represents that attempt, and therefore he restrains his people. The Ralbag has an interesting way of reading this little vignette. Now, I think it's particularly challenging for us to read it as David wanted to kill him. And particularly it's weird because the Pasuk should have then said in verse 5, when it says that David was remorseful about what he did, what should it have said? Why was he remorseful? It should have said David was remorseful because he tried to kill the king. That's not what the Pasuk says. It says he was remorseful because he cut the coat. So that Al-Bad will dance around that and say, but the coat represents his attempt. It doesn't sound like that. Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. But others read this story very differently. So I'd like to share with you the reading that both Rabbi Zak and Rabbi David Silver, I saw this other commentary that I just purchased over the weekend, which has been very, very helpful in this chapter, who they basically combined to say, what happened with David? David never intended himself to kill the king. Rabbi Amnon Bazak says, when he got up, his intention was to cut the cloak. That's what he wanted to do the whole time. He would never planned to actually kill Shaul. He never accepted the words of his men to actually do it. And then he cuts the cloak, and he's even remorseful and regretful over the fact that he cut the cloak. He doesn't even feel he should have done that. But he says, how did the men interpret the cutting of the cloak? They interpreted the cutting of the cloak as David giving them the license for them to go and kill Shaul. That David himself did not want to do the deed by killing Shaul with his own hands, but rather he did a sign which indicated for them to now go and kill Shaul. And that's why after David cuts the cloak, he regrets the fact that he even did that. He now has to go back to his men and tell them, that's not what the sign is. I never wanted you to go and kill him. Don't go kill him. Because the men want to jump in and kill Shaul, and he tells them not to do it. So what's happening here is a disconnect between David's mindset and the mindset of his men. David's mindset is never to kill Shaul. He cuts the cloak, and even that he regrets doing. That's the piety of David. But the men who don't know what's going on in David's mind, they think that David has accepted their petition to kill Shaul, and that the cutting of the cloak is a sign for them to jump in and kill, and that's why they're about to jump in, and that's why David has to restrain them. Two different ways of reading the train of thought over here in these Pesukim, both of which I think paint David in the end of the day as a remorseful person, somebody who's incredibly pious, but the level of piety I think is a little bit different between the Ralbag's reading, where he says he wanted to kill Shaul, versus Rav Bazak and Rav Silver's reading, where he never intended to do that. It was just a matter of communication between he and his men. But David never wanted to do that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about the corner of the cloak. The corner of the cloak obviously has a lot of symbolism over here in many, many different ways, right? Go ahead, Esther.
Spoke about when someone took his shirt.
Right. So this incident transports us back to chapter 15, which was the moment in which Shaul made his devastating mistake of not wiping out Amalek, which is the whole reason why we're in this mess. That's why the kingdom was torn from him. And the scene that best comes to mind is Shaul is turning away from Shemuel is turning away from Shaul. Shaul doesn't want him to leave. He grabs onto the coat. He rips the coat. Shemuel tells him, the way you ripped my coat, that's the way God is going to rip rip the kingdom from you. We also said it's possible to read it the other way, that Shemuel ripped the coat of Shaul and told him, just like I ripped your coat, Hashem will rip the kingdom away from you. And that's coming to fruition now in this chapter. And that's why this symbol, when David shows it to Shaul, and David himself probably understands what the symbol is, that's why it strikes such a chord with Shaul. Because when Shaul sees the ripped coat in the hand of David, what obviously comes to mind? That story comes to mind, and he sees God's prophecy coming full circle, and he realizes if he hadn't already known it before, which he did, it only further solidifies the idea that David is going to take over the kingdom from Shaul.
That's what I first thought of.
Yes. Absolutely. And don't forget, along the way, we also brought up many other symbolisms of clothing. Remember the story, the Battle of Goliath, where Shaul wants to dress David in his armor, and the armor doesn't fit. And David says, I'm not wearing your armor. A sign of, I'm rejecting the clothes which you are giving me because I don't want to assume your kingdom. I want to make a name for my own kingdom. We've seen Yonatan and David make multiple covenants using the idea of cloak, that Yonatan takes off his cloak and dresses David in his cloak as a sign of a berit. So clothes have played a clear symbolic representation of the transference of Shaul's kingdom to David, and that's what we're seeing at its climax right here in this story. What is the interesting is the rabbis learned that David was punished for this. That David was punished. In the end of the day, he himself felt the regret of cutting the cloak of the king, And even he may not have had the rights, the rabbis are looking at it, to even cut the cloak of the king. The rabbis say, what happens to David at the end of his life? We'll read it at the beginning of the book of Melachim. The book of Kings will open up with the idea that David is on his deathbed and he cannot warm his body up. And they bring him clothes to layer on him to warm him up, and the clothes don't work.
Well, why did he get to Shuvah? Because he was, repented right away.
Repent. Nevertheless, just because a person repents doesn't mean that a consequence doesn't ensue. In the end of the day, David stretched his hand to the cloak of the king and overstepped his bounds in the eyes of the Hachamim. And so the rabbis see this can't be a coincidence that David ripped the coat of the king, and now the coats that they're putting on him at the end of his life won't warm him up. So they say anybody who disgraces clothing, they themselves will not benefit from clothing. But I think there's a deeper idea in that David disrespected the office of the monarchy by cutting the cloak of Shaul in that moment. Because in that moment, his intention was not to do what he will do later as a sign or a proof. His intention was to harm Shaul. His intention was to send a message to Shaul. Now he felt bad and he uses it afterwards as a sign. But who says he had the right to do that, right? And this is basically the major question of the chapters, that even though legally he could have, at that moment, Shaul was vulnerable. He should not have. And that's how the rabbis look at this situation. Just as David regretted it, the rabbis say he was punished for that act of stretching out. One last thing that I'll mention before we continue reading the chapter, because we want to get into it, is notice how David consistently calls Shaul Meshiach Adonai, the anointed one of God. Why is he calling him consistently the anointed one of God? And he'll do that a few other times in the rest of the chapter. Because, and this is what Rabbi Silber says, he says, because David was in a conflict. David had an internal conflict about how to look at Shaul. And this is maybe what both Liz and Esther were saying before, right? The men are calling Shaul his enemy, but David has an inner conflict about how to view Shaul. On the one hand, Shaul is not behaving like royalty. He is not acting like a king. He is unjustifiably pursuing David, and he doesn't deserve David's mercy. He doesn't deserve David's respect as the king. That's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, in the end of the day, he is still the king. Regardless of whether he acts like it or not, he is the anointed one of God. And so David has to play this tug of war in his heart about how is he going to look at David, at Shaul, right? How is he going to view him? And that is why David is conflicted. And that is why David keeps calling him Meshiach Hashem. He cannot call him the Melech. In all honesty, David has a hard time calling him the king, because David knows he's been anointed and he knows that Shaul is not behaving like a king. But he consistently calls him Meshiach Hashem in order to lay that boundary, that line, by saying he may not be acting like the king, but in the end of the day, he is. In the end of the day, he was anointed by God.
He was anointed, but David superseded that.
Not yet. That's the point. David has to wait more patiently before he can assume that position. David does not have the right to accelerate the process by which Shaul is removed from king in his own hands. He has to wait. And that's really the conflict. That's what David is saying. And by the way, this will come to benefit David himself. It's ingenious, because David at one point later on in Shemuel Bet will also be called Meshiach Hashem. There will be others who try to unseat David from being the king. And David will say, but I'm the Mashiach Hashem. I'm the anointed one of God. And so David makes a new quasi-status, somebody who is a Mashiach Hashem, an anointed one of God, who no matter what you think about his policy, his behavior, his this, is that, he still occupies that office. He still represents Mashiach Hashem, and therefore you're not allowed to do whatever you want. You have to treat that office with a certain amount of dignity and respect, which David slips up a little bit here, and hence the punishment of the
So it is that you will be, not that
You will be,
are.
yes.
You will.
Yes, correct. Let's continue further on and see how after exiting the cave, the conflict comes to a head. We're up to verse 8 in some books, and others verse 9, where it says, Vayakom David. Vayakom David aharechen. David gets up after this ordeal. Vayetze mehame'ara. He gets out of the cave. Vayikra acharei Shaul. After Shaul. I'm sorry? Oh. Did someone else want to say something? I apologize. Feel free to chime in if you need. Okay, so then we'll continue. Right, Vayikra acharei Shaul lemor. He calls after Shaul saying, Adoni HaMelech, Master the King. Vayabet Shaul acharav. Shaul turns to look behind him. Vayikod David apayim arza vayishtachu. David bows down twice and prostrates himself before Shaul. So we see extreme humility. Despite what David thinks and feels about Shaul, he calls him Adoni HaMelech, and he bows down before him and prostrates himself before him twice. Vayomed David Shaul. David says to Shaul, Lama tishma et divrei Adam lemor. He petitions Shaul in a very heartfelt way. He says, Shaul, why do you listen to the words of man, saying, Hine David mevakesh ra'atecha, that David seeks to harm you. Hine hayom hazeh ra'u einecha, behold, today your eyes have seen. Et asher netanecha Adonai hayom biyadi b'me'ara, that God gave you into my hands today in the cave. Ve'amar laharagecha v'tachos anecha, and he gave me the opportunity, as if saying to me, I should kill you, and yet I had mercy upon you. Va'omar, and I said, Lo eshlach yadi b'adoni, I refuse to stretch my hand against my master. Ki Meshiach Adonai hu, because he is the anointed one of God. Ve'avi re'eh, my father, see, notice how he uses that word. Avi, my father. What an intimate way of showing honor and respect for Shaul. He says, Shaul, you were like a father to me. Remember all those years that I was taken out of my father's home, and I was your servant, and I was your general, and I played the harp for you while bad things were happening. You're like my father, Avi, my father, re'eh. What? And it's his father-in-law, yeah. And let's not forget that, right? That even that slipped my mind. Is his father-in-law, dad, right? He says now he takes away the melech, that distance, that coldness of melech, and he says va'avi re'eh, he's trying to bring them together. When you read this and you see it out loud, just gotta imagine it. You get chills, you get goosebumps at what he's saying. He says re'eh, see et kenaf me'ilcha biyadi. The corner of your coat is in my hand. Ki bechorti et kenaf me'ilcha. Because when I cut the corner of your cloak, velo haragtich, and I didn't kill you, da ur'eh, you should know and see, ki en biyadi ra'ah vafesha. I have no ill will. I have no evil or transgression in my hand. Velo hatati lach, I did nothing against you. Ve'atat sodeh et nafshi lekahta, and yet you are bent on ambushing me and taking my life. I have nothing against you. I had opportunity and I didn't do it. You certainly would not have done the same for me, and yet you pursue me, is what David says. Yishpot Adonai beni ubenecha. May God judge between you and me. Unkamani Adonai mimeka, and may he take vengeance upon you for me. V'yadi lo tiyebach, but my hand will never touch you. Even if God should give me into your hands, I will never touch you, David says. I'm not going to come and to harm you. Ka'asher yomar meshal hakadmoni, like the ancient proverb says, is David quoting, Mereshaim yetzeresha. Wicked deeds come from wicked men. Evil is as evil does, is what they say. In other words, if I acted that way, then that would mean I was evil. I'm not evil, and so evil will not come from me. V'yadi lo tiyebach. Again, he reiterates, my hand shall not be with you. Ahare mi yatsa melech Yisrael, ahare mi ata. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? Now he appeals to a different side of Shaul. He says, Shaul, why you intend to kill me? Who am I? I'm nothing. Kelev met, you're running after ahare kelev met, you're running after a dead dog. Ahare parosh echad, you're running after a single flea. That's what I am, David says. I'm a dead dog, I'm a single flea, I'm nothing. Why are you so obsessed with me? Why are you so running after me? What's the point? V'haya Adonai ledayan. Let God be the arbiter, v'shafat beni ubenecha, and he should judge between you and I. V'yere v'yarev et ribi. May he take note and uphold my cause. V'yishpeteni miyadecha, and vindicate me against you. So you're seeing a little bit of, David is saying, I won't touch you, and I won't do anything to you. And why are you running after me? But I will tell you one thing, God will judge between me and you. So if you keep coming after me, God will vindicate me. I know that God is still protecting me. So there's all different things going on by David. He's petitioning Shaul's heart. He's trying to show admiration and respect for Shaul. He's talking about their family ties. He's trying to appeal to Shaul's love for them and their emotion. He's also telling Shaul, Why are you going to ruin your legacy by chasing after a dead dog? And I'll tell you at the end of the day, if you keep this up though, the little threat there, he says, God will judge between the two of us. I will be vindicated. I know I will come out on top. So why don't we all just let this go, says David. You run out your time. I'm not going to do anything to you. You ride off into the sunset. You finish it out. And then when your time is up, I will take over, right? That's basically what David is saying to him. The more you continue to pursue this conflict, the worse it'll turn out for you, is saying David, not necessarily for me. A lot of different things going on in this appeal by David to Shaul, a lot of different angles that David is hitting Shaul on, all of which point to the same conclusion, which is, let's let this go, right? On many different reasons. Yeah. What is that point that is upsetting to Shaul? That David's going to take over. As opposed to David's going to be the next, he says Shaul's upset at David is going to be the next king, as opposed to his own child.
No, whatever. That the reason he's killing him is not because he thinks David is a physical threat, but he wants to kill him.
But here I think David is maybe is addressing that point by saying to Shaul, guess what? I won't take over while you're still alive. I will not stretch my hand at you. Normally, if someone was going to rebel against you, I would do it while you're alive. I'm going to wait out the time. I'll wait patiently. Yes, God anointed me during your lifetime, but I'm going to let you finish out your tenure on your own. It's not going to be me who's going to kill you. That's what David is telling Shaul, which could have been the concern of Shaul all along. That by David being anointed during his lifetime, at some point David would come after him. And that's why Shaul's going after David as an offensive tactic, potentially. So after David makes this appeal, here's where I think the real goosebumps come in, is Shaul's reaction. And Shaul's reaction is, I think, where the telling nature of his true character really is. And it was when David ceased to express these ideas to Shaul. Shaul says to him, "Hakolecha ze beni David? Is that your voice, my son David?" Right? You have shades. First of all, beni, the usage of the word my son, where David called him my father. You could see that certainly strikes a chord with Shaul. But almost like is that your voice, right? Is that you? Right? You get this image of like a father on his bed, with the child coming at the end of his life and talking to him. Is that you? Is that you? Vayisa Shaul kolo vayef. Shaul raises his voice, he breaks down, and he begins to weep. He cries. Vayomer Shaul el David. Shaul says, Vayomer el David, he says to David, Tzaddik ata mimeni. You are much more righteous than I, David. Ki ata gemaltani hatova. You gave me the good, even though I wasn't deserving of it. Va'ani gemalticha hara'a. And I have treated you badly when you weren't deserving of it. Ve'ata higadta hayom et asher asita iti tova. Yes, you have just revealed how generously you treated me. Et asher sigerani Adonai biyadecha velo haraktani. The fact that God delivered me into your hands and you did not kill me. Does this such a thing happen? This is a rhetorical question. He says, if a man meets his enemy, will he send him on his way in good spirits? No. Man meets his enemy, he fights him. God shall surely reward you for this act. In payment for what you did this day, asher asitali, what you did for me on my behalf. This is perhaps the most bold of all the Pesukim, says Shaul. Now I know that you will surely be king. I'm willing to come to terms with that. And it will come up in your hands. Israel will remain in your hands as your kingdom. And so now the final concern for Shaul is not that David will take over, but is what will happen with Shaul's progeny. What will happen to his children? You have to know a bit about ancient history, which is that anytime a new regime of kings would come up, what's their first order of business? What would they do? They would wipe out all of the progeny, clean house, right? And wipe out, physically kill all of the progeny of the previous regime, because all of them are threats. All of them will come to try and claim the throne. So Shaul assumes when David will take hold of the throne, he will wipe out all his children. Every remnant of Shaul and his kingdom will be obliterated by David. This is the assumption that Shaul makes. And so he says to David in verse 21 or some in 22, Ve'ata hishave ali badonai. Now, behold, swear to me in the name of God, im tachrit et zari aharai, that you will not destroy my zera, my progeny after me. Ve'im tashmid et shemi mi bet avi, and that you will not wipe out my name from my father's house. Vayishava David Shaul. David swears, he takes that oath to Shaul. Vayelech Shaul el beto. Shaul goes back to his home. V'David va'anashav alu ala mitzudah. And David and his men went up to the stronghold. What do you make of this last pasuk? So Shaul clearly accepts, to a degree, the petition of David. He accepts his word. He realizes the truth. You see that Shaul wakes up to what's been going on, and he cries and laments the fact that he has been not in control of himself, that this ruach ra'ah has overtaken him to do something that is not just and is not truthful. And when he finally hears the truth out of David's mouth, his heart breaks. But what do you make of the last pasuk? What would you have expected to see at the very end of this chapter? Yeah, I agree. Esther's right. I would have expected to see some embrace on the part of the two parties. If it's a true reconciliation, I would have expected Shaul to come down from the mountain, David to come down from his place, hug and kiss, weep, we reconcile, like Yosef and his brothers, right? Cry with each other, let's live together, let's ride it out, and da-da-da-da. And what happens? Real reconciliation, but that's not what happens. What happens? They split and they part ways. Shaul goes to his home, and David returns to his men and his strongholds. What does that mean? His mitzudah, his strongholds. What is David gearing up for? He's gearing up for another attack. David knows this is not the final encounter between him and Shaul. He realizes that Shaul knows the truth, but he cannot control himself. And when a person cannot control himself, there's no telling what he's going to do. Although David now is speaking to a thoughtful, lucid Shaul, who knows where he'll be next week, a month from now, we don't know. And so David says, I know this is not the last encounter because Shaul cannot handle himself. And so they separate. Although they know the truth, they've come to a middle ground at least. David can still not trust Shaul. He cannot live together. He cannot embrace him. He needs to go his own separate way. And this will not be the last encounter. David will have another opportunity to kill him 2 chapters from now. In chapter 26, they will have another encounter as Shaul continues to pursue David, despite everything that we saw over here. And that's a little bit of the tragedy of the story, is that although Shaul knows the truth, he can't help himself. And so you see Shaul's character come out for a moment. You see the reconciliation. You see the truth. You see what they're going through. But in the end of the day, the chapter ends on something of a tragic note in that they still cannot live together, even though you reconcile. And it's not unlike what we experience on daily life. How many times do we have somebody we're upset at? You have a conflict with them, a business issue, or whatever type issue. And yes, they ask for forgiveness. Yes, we reconcile. Yes, we this. Yes, we that. But it doesn't mean that we're going to coexist. It doesn't mean that we're going to be part of the same happy-go-lucky situation that we may have had, in days of old, right? There's still too much there that's irreparable, right? And there's too much there between Shaul and David to repair, not to mention the fact that David doesn't know what Shaul is still capable of. And so therefore they have to split and go their separate ways. But I do think, to end on a positive note, this chapter changes a little bit of our perspective of Shaul. It shows us what is really beneath that Shaul's exterior, what is really going on inside, his ability to see the truth, his ability to see what he's doing wrong, his ability to admit Sadiq. He calls David, he says, Sadiq atami meni, you're more righteous than me. Shaul admits that. He admits to David's kingdom, Maloch Timloch, you're going to rule. And all of that is something, it's a big thing. It's a big thing. And for that reason, and maybe that reason alone, Shaul is looked at overall. His legacy is, despite the tragedy of pursuing David, it's overall a positive legacy. He still did many great things, and he still tried, although to no avail, to control himself at the end of his life, which he could not do. Yeah. That's the next chapter. Shemuel dies. Shemuel's so don't confuse Shemuel and Shaul. Now, the next chapter is not going to feature Shaul. The next chapter is going to be an interesting conflict that David has on his own with another person after Shaul's death. Well, Shemuel's death, excuse me. We'll have to talk about Shemuel's death a little bit. We'll talk about David's encounter, and then the story will flip back to Shaul. So we're starting to creep further and further as we get deeper and deeper into the book of Shemuel to now feature more about David as opposed to Shaul. We're moving away from Shaul more towards David, and the book will end, Shemuel Aleph will end with the death of Shaul and Yonatan in
But
battle.
yet he still writes the book of Shemuel back.
Who does?
That's-
Shemuel, yes, Shemuel will die here. The rabbis say that other people finished it, right? But since the majority of it was by Shemuel, and Shemuel kind of set in motion all of the major players, the book is still called Shemuel. Yeah, exactly. Questions, thoughts, ideas? Okay, we'll pause there.